By the end of the 19th century, Africa was collapsing beneath empire. One after another, ancient kingdoms disappeared. Britain advanced from the north and south. France swept across the west. Belgium carved terror into the Congo. Germany expanded through East Africa. Portugal tightened its grip along the coasts. Across the continent, European armies marched with rifles, artillery, machine power, and the belief that nothing could stop them. To the empires of Europe, Africa was no longer a continent of nations. It was territory, land to divide, resources to exploit, people to control. And by the 1890s, it seemed almost inevitable that the entire continent would fall. But hidden deep within the mountains of the Horn of Africa, one empire refused to surrender. An ancient kingdom, protected by brutal highlands, ruled by leaders who understood exactly what was coming. And unlike many nations facing colonial invasion, Ethiopia prepared to fight back. What happened next shocked the world. Because in 1896, against all expectations, an African army defeated a European empire in open battle.
Not through negotiation, not through diplomacy, but on the battlefield. The clash became known as the Battle of Adwa, a battle that shattered the myth of European invincibility, a victory that humiliated Italy, a moment that inspired anti-colonial movements across Africa and the Black world for generations. But Adwa was more than a battle. It was a declaration that Africa would not disappear quietly. This is the story of how Ethiopia stopped an empire and changed history forever.
To understand Adwa, we must first understand the world that created it. During the late 19th century, Europe entered a fierce race for territory in Africa. Industrialization had transformed Europe. Factories demanded raw materials, empires wanted new markets. National pride became tied to colonial expansion, and African land became the prize. Between 1884 and 1885, European powers gathered in Berlin to decide Africa's future. Remarkably, no African representatives were invited. The conference became a diplomatic negotiation over an entire continent. Borders were drawn, claims were recognized, and European leaders treated Africa as if it were empty land waiting to be occupied. The consequences would reshape millions of lives. France expanded across West Africa. Britain tightened its control in Egypt and southern Africa. Belgium seized the Congo with horrifying brutality. Germany established colonies in East and Southwest Africa. Portugal strengthened its coastal possessions. And Italy, one of Europe's newest nations, also wanted an empire.
Unlike Britain or France, Italy had only recently become a unified country. For centuries, the Italian peninsula had been divided into competing kingdoms and states. Only in 1861 did modern Italy emerge as a unified nation. But unity alone was not enough. Italian leaders wanted prestige, power, respect. And in 19th century Europe, great powers were expected to possess colonies. Without an empire, Italy feared appearing weak. Colonial expansion became tied to national pride. Politicians promised glory overseas. Newspapers promoted dreams of conquest. Military leaders wanted victories that would elevate Italy's status in Europe. But Italy faced a problem. Most valuable territories had already been claimed. The race for Africa had begun late for Italy. So Italian leaders turned their attention toward the Horn of Africa. The region offered strategic access to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes. Italian forces first established footholds along the Eritrean coast. From there, ambitions grew, and soon Ethiopia became the target.
Ethiopia was unlike most African states confronting European expansion. It possessed a long imperial tradition. Its rulers traced their legitimacy through centuries of monarchy and religious authority. Christianity had deep roots within Ethiopian society. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a central role in national identity. The country's mountainous terrain also provided natural defensive advantages. Foreign invasions were difficult. Communication across the highlands required experience and endurance. But Ethiopia was not a perfectly unified nation. Regional nobles held considerable power. Internal rivalries often weakened central authority. And for much of the 19th century, the empire experienced political instability. That would begin to change under one man, Menelik II.
Menelik was intelligent, strategic, patient, and deeply aware of the changing world around him. Before becoming emperor, he ruled the kingdom of Shewa. He understood both Ethiopian politics and European ambition. Unlike some rulers who underestimated colonial powers, Menelik studied them carefully. He purchased modern weapons from European suppliers. He built diplomatic relationships. He expanded his influence carefully. And when he became emperor in 1889, Ethiopia entered a new era. Menelik believed Ethiopia could modernize without surrendering its independence. But he also understood something critical. War with Europe was becoming increasingly likely. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed what became known as the Treaty of Wuchale. At first glance, the treaty appeared to establish peaceful relations between both nations. But hidden within the agreement was a dangerous deception. The dispute centered around Article 17. In the Italian language version, Ethiopia was required to conduct foreign affairs through Italy. That would effectively make Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. But in the Amharic version, the wording suggested Ethiopia merely had the option to use Italian diplomatic assistance. The difference was enormous. Italy claimed Ethiopia had accepted colonial status. Menelik insisted Ethiopia remained fully sovereign. Whether through deliberate deception or manipulation, the treaty became a ticking time bomb. When Menelik discovered Italy's interpretation, relations collapsed, and the emperor made his position unmistakably clear. Ethiopia would never become a colony.
As tensions grew, Menelik began preparing for conflict on an unprecedented scale. Across Ethiopia, calls for mobilization spread. Regional leaders were ordered to gather troops. Farmers became soldiers. Warriors marched from distant provinces. Nobles brought cavalry forces. Priests blessed armies before departure. Women played a crucial role in sustaining the war effort. Many carried food, water, medical supplies, and equipment across enormous distances. The mobilization was extraordinary. Some historians estimate Ethiopia assembled over 100,000 fighters. It became one of the largest African armies of the 19th century. And importantly, Ethiopia was not armed only with spears. Menelik had spent years acquiring modern rifles and artillery from European powers.
Many Ethiopian troops carried advanced firearms. This shocked European observers, who expected an outdated army. Italy underestimated Ethiopia repeatedly, and that mistake would prove catastrophic. Despite growing Ethiopian resistance, many Italian officials remained confident. European colonial ideology had created dangerous assumptions. Across Europe, many believed African armies could not defeat modern European forces. Colonial victories elsewhere reinforced this arrogance. Italian newspapers predicted easy triumph. Politicians expected a glorious campaign. Military commanders assumed superior organization and discipline would guarantee victory. But beneath the confidence, cracks were emerging. Italian forces operating in Eritrea faced supply problems. The harsh terrain slowed movement. Morale fluctuated. And some commanders privately worried about Ethiopia's growing military strength. One of those commanders was General Oreste Baratieri. Baratieri understood the danger better than many politicians back in Rome. He knew Ethiopia's army was massive. He knew the terrain favored defenders. And he knew a reckless assault could end in disaster. But political pressure pushed Italy toward confrontation. The government demanded victory. Retreat would humiliate Italy. And so the march toward Adwa continued.
One of the most influential figures during the crisis was Empress Taytu Betul. Strong-willed, politically intelligent, and fiercely patriotic, Taytu opposed Italian expansion from the beginning. She distrusted colonial promises and urged resistance. During the campaign, she played a major role in logistics and morale. Sources describe her helping organize supplies and support for Ethiopian forces. She also represented the determination of Ethiopian women during the war. Too often, historical narratives focus only on kings and generals. But Ethiopia's resistance depended on entire communities. Women transported provisions, cared for wounded fighters, maintained supply systems, and sustained the enormous army gathering in the highlands. Adwa was not merely the victory of an emperor. It was the mobilization of a nation.
By early 1896, both armies moved toward the mountainous region around Adwa in northern Ethiopia. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Steep ridges, rocky hills, narrow valleys. For armies unfamiliar with the terrain, navigation became difficult. Ethiopian forces, however, knew the land intimately. They used scouts effectively. Communication moved rapidly between commanders, and morale remained high. Italian troops faced mounting difficulties. Food shortages emerged. Supplies stretched thin. Soldiers grew exhausted. General Baratieri hesitated. He knew attacking such a large Ethiopian force carried enormous risk. But again, politics intervened. Italian leaders accused him of weakness. Pressure intensified. And eventually, Baratieri decided to advance. It was a decision that would define his career and Italy's colonial future.
On the night before battle, tension filled the mountains around Adwa. Thousands of Ethiopian fighters waited in darkness. Italian troops prepared for a surprise attack planned before dawn. The Italian strategy depended on speed and coordination. Several brigades would move separately through mountainous terrain and attack Ethiopian positions simultaneously. But the plan immediately began to unravel. Maps were inaccurate. Communication broke down. Units became separated in darkness. Officers struggled to navigate unfamiliar terrain.
Confusion spread before the battle even began. Meanwhile, Ethiopian scouts detected Italian movements. Menelik's commanders reacted quickly. What Italy intended as a surprise assault was turning into chaos, and dawn had not yet arrived.
March 1st, 1896. The Battle of Adwa begins. As dawn broke across the Ethiopian highlands, Italian brigades found themselves dangerously exposed. Separated units lost contact with one another. Some advanced too far ahead. Others became trapped in difficult terrain. The Ethiopian response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of fighters surged toward isolated Italian positions. Rifle fire erupted across the mountains. Artillery thundered through valleys. War cries echoed across the battlefield. Italian soldiers fought fiercely, but coordination collapsed rapidly. Entire brigades became surrounded. Ethiopian commanders exploited every weakness. Cavalry forces attacked vulnerable flanks. Infantry pressed relentlessly forward. The scale of Ethiopian mobilization stunned the Italians. This was not a scattered tribal resistance. This was a massive organized army, and it was determined to destroy the invasion.
The fighting became brutal. Some battles descended into close-range combat with bayonets, swords, and spears. The mountainous terrain intensified confusion. Smoke obscured visibility. Orders failed to reach units. Italian formations disintegrated under relentless assault. As casualties mounted, panic spread. Retreat became increasingly difficult. Roads clogged with wounded soldiers. Command structures collapsed. Some officers attempted desperate defensive stands. Others fled. By midday, the Italian army was breaking apart. Adwa had become a catastrophe.
The scale of the defeat shocked Europe. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Large quantities of weapons and equipment fell into Ethiopian hands. Italy's dream of easy conquest had collapsed completely. For Ethiopia, the victory was extraordinary. An African army had defeated a European colonial force in open battle. At a time when much of Africa was falling under colonial rule, Ethiopia remained independent. The psychological impact was enormous. Across Europe, newspapers reacted with disbelief. Many colonial assumptions suddenly looked fragile. The myth of European invincibility had been shattered.
News of Adwa spread rapidly around the world. In Italy, outrage exploded. The defeat humiliated the government. Political crises followed. Protests erupted. For many Italians, Adwa became a national trauma. But elsewhere, the battle inspired hope. Across Africa and the African diaspora, Ethiopia's victory carried profound symbolic power. At a moment when colonialism appeared unstoppable, Adwa proved resistance was possible. Black intellectuals, activists, and anti-colonial thinkers celebrated the victory. Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and sovereignty. The battle would later inspire Pan-African movements and anti-colonial struggles throughout the 20th century. Adwa was no longer just a military event. It had become an idea. Why did Ethiopia win at Adwa? The answer lies in several critical factors. First, leadership. Menelik successfully unified diverse regional forces under a common cause. Second, preparation.
Ethiopia acquired modern weapons and ammunition before the war. Third, logistics. Despite enormous challenges, Ethiopian supply systems sustained a massive army. Fourth, terrain. Ethiopian commanders understood the mountains far better than invading forces. And finally, Italian miscalculation. Colonial arrogance led Italy to underestimate its opponent repeatedly. Adwa demonstrated a truth many imperial powers ignored. Technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory, especially against determined resistance supported by effective leadership and national unity.
The legacy of Adwa still resonates today. Ethiopia remained independent during the colonial era, though Italy would invade again decades later under Benito Mussolini. But the memory of Adwa endured. For Ethiopians, the battle became a cornerstone of national identity. For Africans under colonial rule, it represented defiance. For the black diaspora, it became proof that European domination was not inevitable. Even today, historians view Adwa as one of the most important anti-colonial victories in modern history. It altered international perceptions. It disrupted imperial assumptions, and it reminded the world that resistance could succeed.
In 1896, the world expected Ethiopia to fall. Europe possessed industrial armies, global empires, and modern weapons. Africa was being divided by foreign powers. And yet, in the mountains of Adwa, history turned. Farmers became warriors. Regional rivals united. An emperor refused submission. And an African nation defeated a European empire. The Battle of Adwa was more than a victory. It was a declaration that sovereignty mattered, that dignity mattered, and that even in an age of empire, resistance was possible. More than a century later, Adwa still echoes through history. Not simply because Ethiopia won, but because the battle challenged the belief that colonial conquest was unstoppable. And in doing so, it inspired generations far beyond the mountains where the battle was fought. The story of Adwa remains one of the most extraordinary moments in African and world history. A reminder that even against overwhelming odds, people who refuse to surrender can change the course of history forever.
If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more deep historical stories from Africa and around the world. Because history is not just about the past, it explains the world we live in today.